projects manager at the Terdezom Regional Office for Europe. We're based in Budapest. And I'm also managing a regional project called Bridge, which stands for Building Relationships Through Innovative Development of Gender-Based Violence Awareness in Europe. So this is a regional project we're managing here from Budapest in partnership with Defense for Children International and Fedazil in Belgium, Arsis NGO in Greece, the COPIN NGO in Malta, and with Terdezom in Romania. The project is supported by the European Union's Rights and Equality and Citizenship Program 2014-2020. And with this project, we're working to strengthen the statutory response to gender-based violence of practitioners to gender-based violence affecting children and youth on the move in the EU. As part of this project, we, in addition to capacity building activities and data collection activities, we are also organizing a series of webinars to discuss issues of gender-based violence, to share knowledge, learning, and good practices. And the purpose of today's webinar is to demonstrate, show the handbook that has been developed by HEUNI. This is the European Institute for Crime Prevention and Control based in Finland. And this has been developed with them and obviously a number of organizations in Croatia, Cyprus, Germany, Greece, Finland, and Italy. And the development of this handbook has involved the co-creation process, and it includes a counseling method for women refugees who have been victims of gender-based violence. In today's webinar, our speaker is Ms. Inka Vilja. She will be talking us through this handbook. She holds a law degree and is working as a senior program officer at the European Institute for Crime Prevention and Control. And she has also been responsible for developing and coordinating several of this institute's projects related to the rights of victims of crime. So we are very thankful to Inka for being available with us today to share their work. And I hope you will all enjoy the webinar. Thank you very much, Inka. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Introduction, and I'm really happy to see you all. Greetings from very rainy Helsinki, not winter-like at all. Yes, so I'm very happy to introduce you the handbook we've been developing for the past 2 years. And as was mentioned, it's available in 6 languages, in English, Finnish, Italian, Greek, Croatian, German, Italian. Did I miss something? On our webpage. And also in the Child Hub, there's the English version available at least. So I will tell you first a few words about how the handbook was developed and a few of the kind of background factors, and then I will going through the counseling method that is like the core of the handbook. So as was mentioned, the handbook was developed in a project where there were 6 EU countries involved and 7 NGOs in these countries who provided practical assistance to asylum-seeking and refugee women who had been victims of gender-based violence for the duration of 2 years. And during this, giving this practical assistance, we also collected a large data set about the experiences of women on gender-based violence and on how the counselors felt, what kind of challenges and best practices they learned during these counseling sessions. So throughout the project, we had over 4,000 counseling sessions, as you can see here in the picture. We identified over 3,000 victims of gender-based violence among the refugee and asylum-seeking women. They were mostly women, so some underage, but mostly young ladies between 25 and 32, I believe. We have some background variables from over 1,000 cases, so from where did they come from, how many children they had, and that kind of background variables. But the biggest data was this qualitative data, which we collected through a very interesting methodology that we developed for this project, called a journal methodology, and it meant that all the 30 counselors working in these 6 countries, in these 7 organizations, wrote to us every week for the duration of a year about their week. So what kind of women they had met, what kind of violent experiences the women had, what were the women's needs, their desires, their challenges in the assistance system. And from this huge amount of data that we collected, we created the handbook. And actually, we also now are just about to publish a research report that goes into more in depth about the experiences and violence. The handbook is really a practical tool for practitioners, but this research report that will come out in February is more analytical approach to the data. And yes, it was a very interesting process because we had all these journals from 30 counselors writing about their weekly experiences working with these women. And then we had 8 mutual learning workshops where we got together everybody from these organizations and we discussed the best practices and the challenges they had in assisting these women, and this all then was compressed into a handbook. So it was a very interesting process. And just as a last note from this slide, that the counselors were either social workers, lawyers giving legal assistance, or then they were psychologists. So we have also like a range of professionals, which was also very interesting because of course they look at the phenomena from a different perspective. So here are the forms of gender-based violence that we identified in the project. I don't know what kind of thoughts and first reactions arise from these pictures. To you, each of you, it would be an interesting discussion, but maybe you can, if something particular comes into mind, you can mention in the chat, or we can discuss in the end. But we also used in the counseling session this kind of pictograms, because for many women, as I will talk later, it was difficult to kind of describe what had happened, or they didn't have words for the violent incidents. So the first one is forced marriage. It was very prevalent in this data. Domestic or intimate partner violence is the next one. Sexual exploitation, including rape, stalking, then human trafficking, particularly for sexual exploitation in our data set. Then there was honor-based violence, female genital mutilation, and then sexual harassment is the last pictogram. And just a few words on the data before, or kind of the general phenomena, what we found out was that it was not isolated incidents of violence for these women, but they faced a continuum of violence, or actually several continuums of violence. So many of the women in our data had been victims of violence, of different acts of violence. So for example, psychological violence and then physical violence, or slaps and then very harsh physical violence, sexual harassment, rape. So there was a continuum of acts. Then also many of the women had been victims of violence throughout their lifetime. So as a child, they had been victims of sexual exploitation, maybe early marriage. Forced marriage led very often to domestic violence. And then in some cases, there was a pattern that when the women actually escaped their home country because of domestic violence, they ended up in trafficking. Because they had very few resources for the travel and so on. The research report will talk about this more in depth if you're interested. And then the third continuum is what you can see in the picture, is this geographic continuum. So actually the violence crossed borders for these women. So there was violence in their home country, as you can see the house, which represents the country of origin. And sometimes the gender-based violence was the push factor why they left their home countries. Then for many women, they faced violence during the journey, in particular trafficking and sexual exploitation. And then unfortunately also when they arrived to Europe, a big proportion of the women in our data also became victims of violence, or the violence continued in the European Union. So even though they came to Europe to seek protection from the violence, they also faced violence in the EU for many reasons. Which again you can read from our report because it's quite complex. This continue. And then what we could also see is that when these women came to Europe, there are two main protection systems in the European Union to protect asylum-seeking victims of gender-based violence. So we have the other tower is the asylum system, and the other tower is the criminal justice system, which are aimed at protecting and supporting victims of violence and gender-based violence. But for these women, from the data, we could see that for them, these systems were like these insurmountable mountains where it was very difficult for them to get assistance from and kind of climb the steps and go through the small window, which was kind of the opportunity to be assisted. The asylum system as such, I mean, there are many issues, such as if gender-based violence is considered persecution and is a valid claim for an asylum. Then there are many procedural steps where kind of women are underprivileged because they should be able to tell about the violence, for example, sexual violence, to authorities in order to gain access to the criminal justice system. And then, of course, also the asylum system is only interested of the violence that took place in the home country. It's not interested on the continuum that the women are still maybe in danger or facing violence. And then what we also found out is that the criminal justice system, I'm sure that many of you are quite aware of kind of the limitations why asylum-seeking or refugee women in the European Union don't report crimes. I mean, language issues, not knowing the system, maybe a history of abuse by authorities, no trust in the official system, family and pressure and so on. But also what we could see in our data was that for these women, they couldn't see that the criminal justice system could help them while they were still in the asylum seeking system. So in a way, before you have certainty that you and your children can stay in the country, you are kind of, the criminal justice system cannot offer you anything because maybe you will be out of the country next week. So this was kind of a dilemma for the women, and of course, from a systematic perspective, it's very worrying if this group of women do not report violence. In our data, it was quite a low percentage of women who actually had reported in the European Union the violence they had faced. And if this violence is not reported, of course, it remains an invisible phenomena, and which then again leads that, for example, there are no resources for fighting gender-based violence if it's not visible in the statistics. Okay, that's about kind of the big picture. And then what we kind of want to do with the counseling, creating the method for counseling these women who have been victims of gender-based violence. We looked at the missing steps and kind of what can be done so that the women can actually reach the assistance and the rights they have based on European legislation. And for this, we created this counseling method. So we refer to counseling about counseling and what's the actual work that these organizations and the counselors in these organizations are doing, is giving psychosocial and legal counseling. And usually it's a series of one-on-one sessions, sometimes taking, they would meet the women weekly for a month. Sometimes the counseling could go on for years. But usually it was a relatively short time where they met the women face to face. The counseling is an opportunity to be heard and to tell your story. And we discussed a lot about this story because it's very relevant for many reasons. Firstly, the systems, they need a story. The asylum system needs a story of persecution. If you want to have a refugee status, you need to have a certain kind of story of persecution. And the women need to be able to kind of understand what is expected of the story. And here I'm not referring to making up a story or kind of, duplicating a story or doing something like that, but actually for the women or the asylum seekers to understand what is expected in the system, because it's a very particular kind of context, the asylum interview. Also, the criminal justice system wants a story. It wants the details of what happened, whether a crime took place or not. And then the story was also very meaningful for the women. Maybe something else was more important for them to tell to the assistance provider than the story that was expected in the asylum system. Maybe they were more worried about the future of the children or the relatives that were left behind than actually talking about gender-based violence. So this story plays a lot of different roles that will come later again in the counseling method as described in the handbook. Then, of course, the women are informed about their rights as victims of crime and as asylum seekers. This is a very important part of the counseling. That little by little, as the story unfolds, you are also informed what rights you have in our systems. And then also very practical needs are mapped. So housing, maybe looking for missing children, missing family members, missing documents, applying for family unification, applying for divorce. Where to find an income, where to sleep next night. The women had different needs, kind of. The whole life situation was looked at, not only the violence or the past or the current violence, but kind of the full spectrum of the needs of the women. And then also this empowerment was something that the counselors talked a lot, and kind of the picture in the cover of the handbook and here in the slide describes the empowerment of the women's that is kind of the impact of a good counseling, that the women are kind of climb up this waterfall that is full of rocks and swirls and all kinds of challenges to the top where they can be healed from the crime, violence, and also integrated into the new home country. And then this is kind of what we talk about when we talk about counseling. And then the next chapter in the handbook talks about the resources and structures that are needed in order to do this effective counseling. And the first point is committed organization. This was very important, that the counselors really need the support of the supervision and the directors of the organization, and also that the organization have kind of long-term plans to assist these kind of victims, because sometimes the counseling processes can be quite long, and it's very unethical to start a counseling process with these vulnerable victims, traumatized people, if you are not unsure if you can actually offer the service until the person is ready to kind of take her own steps. Then very practical need is a safe space. Some of these organizations in our project were working in Greece, for example, in refugee camps. So they really had to think about where they can meet the women and where the women can come, so that, for example, the perpetrators, often their husbands, are not aware that they will go somewhere to talk about their violent experiences. So this is something that was discussed a lot. For some organizations, they invited the women to general activities in their premises, to language courses or women's groups, and then the women were given the opportunity to get also one-on-one counseling. Then this multidisciplinary team is something that was very important or is very important for this counseling, because as I tried to describe, the women need assistance in legal issues, they need assistance from a social worker, and they often need also psychological assistance. And in these organizations, not all, but in some of them, they actually had a team of 3 professionals assisting these women, one being the case manager. But then we also had organizations with fewer resources, and they actually had one person doing kind of multitasking and then using her networks to then find, for example, legal guidance. Then workplace counseling. This was something that was discussed a lot. And by workplace counseling, I mean professional counseling for the counselors, because it's very mentally demanding work to work every day with very traumatized victims who have faced very harsh violence and have very sad stories. And we did have quite a big turnover in the project. So we had quite a few counselors who actually got a burnout and had to leave the project, probably also for other reasons, but I would say that because the mental burden is very high, and that's why the supervision should be is extremely important. I will talk a bit in the end, if I have time, about the kind of self-help tools also that were developed in order to assist the counselors to cope with the mental burden of the work. And then lastly, interpretation. This was also very much discussed. And of course, when you are discussing topics of very traumatizing topics, very mentally burdening topics, very sensitive issues, the interpretation is very important. I mean, interpretation as such, of course, have a lot of challenges. Somebody says you have like a third person there, a third brain, and everything is filtered through this interpreter. And what we found out is that when we talk about gender-based violence, also the interpreters would have their own attitudes towards, what women can do and cannot do. What is violence against women? What is acceptable? Is rape in marriage acceptable? Is forced marriage, acceptable? And also the interpreters might have their own trauma that would come out in the counseling sessions and then interfere with the relationship between the customer and the counselor. And that's why we discuss in the handbook kind of how to overcome some of these challenges. Also, confidentiality is very important, and with interpreters in many countries, especially if you talk about rare languages or dialects, you have the issue that the migrant communities are very small and people would actually know each other. So then if you have an interpreter from same or close community, the woman would not feel comfortable talking about domestic violence or sexual violence that she has encountered. And then in particular, the counselors all of them preferred to use female interpreters because the women felt more comfortable talking about GBV with female interpreters. And I think this was then, when you talk about policy recommendations, this is in many countries an issue that there's not enough female interpreters. But I'm sure many of you also work with interpreters, and this is a very heated discussion sometimes, and very important one, of course. Okay, then we have the steps of counseling. So this is the 3rd chapter of the handbook, where we go through kind of the process of counseling. And as I said, this is something that is kind of a combination of the experiences of 30 counselors from 6 different countries. But it's quite interesting how similar approaches in the end, if you kind of take the essence of everybody's lessons and learned and their best practices, how kind of uniform way of working they had or developed during the course of the project. So we have, what we could find out is that there are 4 steps, main steps. The first one is building trust with the client. Then the second one is informing her on her rights. The third one is the story. So kind of picking up the pieces of the story and reclaiming her own story. And then the last one is the choice, how to support the customer, the client, the woman to make her own choices. And then around is this network of other actors, which is very important. And there is a particular chapter or sub-chapter on these different actors that you have to network with when you're working with asylum-seeking or refugee women, victims of GBV, because they are kind of in between many assistance and legal systems. So we have medical aid providers, we have the interpreters, we have the legal system, we have legal aid providers, we have the asylum-seeking system, the migration officers, we have accommodation providers, whether it's a reception center, deportation center, private housing, safe house, so on and so on. And kind of this network that you are able to create locally, it's very meaningful in order for you to be able to help these women that have different needs, not only related to the violence, but then also in order to kind of step out of the violence or to heal or survive from the violence. And then the one dot with the small flags refers to transnational cooperation, because what we also could see is this Dublin regulation and how it influences these women, because sometimes they had already started a counseling process or were working with other assistance providers, and then suddenly they got a decision that they would be moved to another European country. And what we could do in some very lucky cases was that the organization giving the counseling in one country, for example, Germany, would then refer this customer to another organization doing similar counseling in Italy. But I mean, often the women would kind of have to start all over again, building trust and learning about the system. Here we did a few of these kind of checklists on basic things that you should remember during the counseling process. In a way, it's not anything really complicated in a way. I mean, you have to be present. You have to listen to the customer. It's very important to listen in a non-judgmental manner in the beginning. It's very important to have pauses because many of the women were very traumatized and just couldn't discuss for a long periods of time about the violence they had experienced or their life. And then what we developed that is also available at the end of the handbook is these activities. So for example, the counselors learn to use these pictograms and then picture cards that are kind of where you can express through pictures even without having a common language sometimes, or if you don't have kind of words for the violence, you can use these cards. And I mean, for many counselors, they kind of felt that kind of what I will talk next in the building trust part is that if the organization had general activities for the women, be it language classes, cooking, crafting, anything, that would kind of first create the relationship between the customer and the organization. And then you could start to go to these one-on-one counseling sessions and little by little kind of create the relationship where the women felt that they could talk about violence. In many cases, the counselors were the first persons to whom the women had actually talked about their experiences of gender-based violence. And this is, of course, very sad, in particular in cases where the women would only reach out to the counselors when they already had gotten a negative decision and they hadn't talked about the gender-based violence in their asylum interview. And if they hadn't said anything, of course, it couldn't be a basis for an asylum. So what was very strongly visible in our data was this, that these women were highly traumatized by the violent accidents, and this, this continuum of they had been often victims of violence throughout their lifetime, and really had problems trusting people. In the handbook, there are some general guidelines on how to kind of little by little start to build this trust. And I think one very important thing is this, that the counselors took the attitude that they, from the beginning, sometimes the stories were so horrific that you couldn't kind of want to believe in them. But the customer will very easily kind of feel it if you are not believing the full story. And kind of it's important the counselors could take the position where they can just listen everything, and they do not have to fit the story into certain criteria, like criminal justice authorities or asylum officers have to fit the story into certain requirements. But the counselors, it was just first to listen the full story, and then to start to solve the practical issues, the practical needs that the women had. And then in the next step, or in the third step, to kind of also pick up the pieces of the story where they can help the women to tell their story to the authorities if the women so decide. Few more things on this building trust is that the counselors were emphasized that you have to be very clear where you can assist. Of course, you would like to assist in many things, but kind of what are the rights and where you can help them. It must be very clear with this group of GBV victims. Then the second step is this giving information. And there, I mean, we have a very varied group of women in the dataset. We have highly educated women. We have women who have never gone to school. We have illiterate women. We have women who can speak several languages. We have women who can only speak a certain dialect. So it's a very varied group coming from a varied, we had women from 52 countries, I believe, so coming from very different systems. So then you cannot take the approach that, you take the European Fundamental Rights Chart and start to read what are your rights or the Victims' Rights Directive. But it's kind of have to be what we learned, a process of discussion on what, first to identify whether you have been a victim of gender-based violence, whether you have been victim of a crime, and then what this applies in your case. What you can and what you should maybe do. Should you report the crime? Do you have right to access certain services because you have been a victim of crime, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, many of the women had also questions naturally about the asylum seeking process, not only the criminal process, but then related to family law. Can I divorce my abusive husband? How does it happen in this country? Then, well, there were many complexities, of course, then also related to, for example, Islamic divorce. Is it possible here? How does it work? Custody of children, and all these kind of, there's like this legal maze that the women have to survive. And I always say that I'm a lawyer, but if I would have to seek asylum in Finland, I would fail because it's such a complex process. But the women need information. What are their rights in the system or in the systems? And sometimes the organization would have the luxury of having their own legal professional in the organization who would take the lead in this legal information giving. Sometimes then the counselors had to seek themselves information case by case in order to be able to support these women. And then there was this particular topic that victims of trafficking have certain specific rights, and usually there are national assistance systems for this group of victims. So in many cases, it was very important to recognize the victims of trafficking because they have specific rights in the assistance systems, or they have their own assistance system in the countries. There are these cases that are on the slides. They are all from the journals, but maybe I will read this case to you, which tells about kind of the complexities of informing on your rights. She's currently in the process of assigning of a legal guardian, considering the fact that she's a minor. She did not understand the term of guardian, so I explained to her the purpose and position of role of the guardian and what kind of value it has for her. Here it is important to emphasize that I used very simplified examples, considering the fact that her English is not so proficient and that she lacks the knowledge about the legal system in general. However, in the beginning of the conversation, she was very confused and scared, so she asked me if this guardian is something like a madam in the brothel. So this underage girl thought that this guardian is something that she had experienced while she was trafficked into prostitution. So it can be, you need to think very carefully kind of how to explain and open these legal terms. I think it's a very enlightening example. Then the third step in counseling is what we call helping her to reclaim her story. And this is what I talked already a little bit about, that these systems, the asylum system and the criminal justice system, need a very coherent, detailed story that moves in a chronological order. You know, what happened to you and what happened next, who did it, what happened then, why did you have to escape your country? And it's often very difficult for traumatized person to kind of produce this kind of chronological detailed story. And this was discussed a lot because we had psychologists in the group, and how the traumatic memories are actually differently produced in your brain, and how sometimes, you know, traumatized people just cannot remember things, cannot remember the traumatic event, cannot remember details. They can just remember the feeling of fear or horror of the moment, but it's not like a normal memory. It will be filed in a different file. And how sometimes also when you're telling your story, traumatized persons might totally unintentionally skip the traumatic part of the story. And of course, from an interviewer's point of view, this sounds like a very untrustworthy story. But I mean, what's important and what the counselors did a lot was to kind of, together with the women, to recollect the story, not only in order to be able to claim for these rights that they had, but then also it's very important for the victims themselves to understand what actually happened. And I'm not a trauma therapist, but this is how they explained it, that kind of, you know, rewriting your story can, and remembering and understanding your story can also be healing experience psychologically. And also importantly, kind of that victims of gender-based violence often become victims of again and again, and kind of understanding the background factors, why I'm becoming a victim, why I trust certain kind of people, for example, is kind of a key to getting out of this loop of being re-victimized. Of course, I'm not saying that it's the fault of the victim that they are being victims again and again, but there is this certain kind of psychological power and control mechanism and so on. And then some of the counselors also really practiced with the women the asylum interview, because it's a very stressful situation. you have to talk to a total stranger, an officer in a very official environment. So they would go through what kind of questions there could be, how to remember to tell all the details that are relevant in order for you to access the rights you have as a victim of gender-based violence. Maybe here again, I will read to you this very enlightening example about this being able to tell your story. So the counselor writes, from my experience, it is normal for a client when there is a huge trauma to not want to discuss about it and ignore it instead, wishing that with time the wound will heal automatically. But unfortunately, in reality, this is not the case. I always try in the first sessions to be more psychoeducative and tell my clients that psychotherapy will help them feel better in the long run. And although it may seem difficult to talk about traumatic experiences, it can be cathartic too. My concern, not only with domestic violence cases, but with all kinds of GBV incidents, is that the victim has the tendency to get into the same situation that she was used to. That is why it's very important to analyze the situation with the victim. It is important for the client to understand why everything happened in order to continue not to repeat the past again. So here were the kind of the themes of how the story can be healing and how to kind of understand the background factors. And then the last step in the counseling is this supporting her choice. So there was really this balance the counselors had to take on where to kind of make decisions or push the women to take some decision, for example, whether to report a crime or to leave an abusive situation, and when to kind of, you have to just wait for the client to be ready to take that step. And in some cases, when the counselors kind of pushed too much to a certain direction, some of the women just disappeared and never came back to the counseling, which made the counselors very worried about the women and sometimes their children. And also, it's important to understand this, which is explained more in detail here, this kind of power and control that happens, for example, in trafficking, and how the trafficker has different ways of control the victim, and how therefore it's difficult to leave this situation and seek assistance, or to do some steps that would be actually helpful for you. The same power and control, or similar power and control, takes place in domestic violence often. Then the counselors always also emphasize that the women are not only victims, they have also resilience, they are very courageous, they have gone all the way here to Europe, crossed long dangerous journeys, that they really have a lot of strength, willpower, skills that they can use to go on in their lives, and they should. It's a big mistake if you just see the clients as mere victims. How much more do I have?
Don't worry, you have 10 more minutes. Don't worry.
10 minutes. Okay,
yeah.
Good.
Okay.
Okay, then I have good time to go through. Then in the chapter 3, in the cross-cutting issues, I will talk about two of the cross-cutting issues. You can find out more about the others in the handbook. The first one is the safety of the clients and staff. So this has to be considered in all the activities. I mean, because you are sometimes working with clients that are threatened by criminal networks or otherwise dangerous perpetrators. So a few things to consider is to make sure that the premises where you are counseling the women are safe. I mean that the very practical things, the doors can be locked from the inside, that there are escape routes and so on. Then it's very important that you have a working relationship with the local police. They know that you are counseling women that can be threatened by violent persons, and kind of that the police knows that if you contact them, they need to come, or that you can, together with the police, organize safety measures for the staff and the clients in case this happens. I must say, I mean, throughout the 2 years that we worked together, there was not a single serious incident towards the staff. I mean, of course, the clients are sometimes living all the time in a very difficult situation, and that is threatening them physically and mentally and sexually. But it's of course better to be prepared. Then this cooperation with safe houses, many times the women were referred to women houses, women's shelters or safe houses when they decided to leave the abusive husband. Of course, it's also some women did not want to go to the safe houses, for example, because there are usually very strict house rules in order to keep the customers safe. And it's interesting that, well, from a researcher's perspective, it's interesting, but in reality, it's very sad. But if these women had been, for example, been confined by traffickers into, locked rooms or so on, so they did not feel comfortable living in a safe house where it was very limited, the movement was very limited. Then the picture is also there because, I mean, often if we talk about stalking or order-based violence, following the women, the husbands tracking them, the mobile phones are quite easy to be used as a tracking devices, and this is something that needs a bit of thinking if you want to keep the victims safe. And then, of course, we have legal measures such as protection orders that can be used to safeguard the victims. And then, as a last cross-cutting issue, what I mentioned in the beginning is this helping the helpers. And this is a quote again from the journal that I think very well describes the feelings of the counselors assisting these traumatized customers. I'm so exhausted, like somebody got me and took some pieces of my body. It is unbelievable how the value in life in some parts of the planet is so low. I honestly don't know how to deal with all these negative emotions that I have after these sessions. I'm so happy when I see that sessions are helpful and recovering for the clients, but I don't know what to do with all the burden that stay with me afterwards. So the counselors were quite openly discussing their feelings in the journals, in the weekly journals. I mean, they were sharing the happy stories when somebody got an asylum decision, when somebody got their children with them. I mean, there were a lot of very happy stories. But then also they discussed about the burden of the work. We had a full 2-day training then about this self-help and how to, as a professional, stay professional and kind of keep up with the mental burden of the work. And there were these 2 key terms that I would like to share. There was this compassion fatigueness. So kind of when you get just too much and of the burden of the customer, and it can lead to burnout, to depression. You get a really cynical worldview just hearing about bad things that can happen to people. But then on the other side, there's also compassion satisfaction. I mean, the satisfaction from being able to help somebody, from what the counselors always talk about, small smiles, feeling having the feeling that you understood each other, that you have the trust of the client. It's also something that can really give you something as a professional, being able to help, and that kind of motivates you in your work, even though when there are the difficult issues. Should I say something here? Yeah. And then we discussed a lot, and there are some tools in the handbook on how to kind of take care of yourself. I would say one of the most important things is peer support. So your colleagues being able to work in a team, being able to share, discuss cases, share the workload, and so on. Then the professional supervision, which I already mentioned. If you're doing this kind of work, you should be able to receive your own counseling in order to not, that the cases will not just keep on rolling in your head. And then you can also do self-care. You can do small things that will help you in everyday work. These are things that are, some of them are useful for anybody, even though you work with a bit maybe lighter subject. So there's a link to this self-reflection test on mental burden that all the counselors took to see kind of if they themselves realized are they burdened or not. Then there are these links to online courses on self-awareness and mindfulness. Then we discussed about very simple kind of cleaning routine, mental cleansing routines that between customers, you take a break, you say to yourself, okay, that's it, now it's out of me, and next one, or you go for a little walk, you take some breathing exercise, this kind of very simple like routines that psychologists also do use. And then we also discussed that this journal writing, that the counselors would write every week down their feelings, that for some it was a helpful tool, that they really did self-reflection, they understood what went wrong, they could give themselves praise. For others it didn't work because they started to think too much kind of the negative issues and go again the negative things in the week. But some psychologists do use journal writing as a method of self-help, but then you have to make sure that the kind of journal is structured so that you kind of end the journal with the kind of the good things that you learned, not just rolling over in or like going over and over again the negative issues. But it's something that everybody can try. Then we have this pocket card. You can cut from the handbook and put it in your pocket. It helps everybody to keep up with their workload with very, very simple things like share a joke every day. Yep. Maybe I will stop there, just saying that we also used, aside from the counseling, we used this InfoCafe methodology, which is it's a group discussion and way of giving peer support to victims of GBV and discussing gender-based violence and such in a group situation. And there's the last chapter talks about InfoCafes, but I will not talk about it in detail now. Maybe we'll have not a webinar on InfoCafes, and I want to leave some time for a few comments, hopefully. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Inka, for the very interesting webinar. Thank you for sharing all this useful information about the handbook. I've shared the link in the chat, and also you can find it in the webinar page. I believe it will be, and it already is available for many counselors, social workers, and psychotherapists who are working with these women. Also, thank you for taking some time on talking about the supervision and the way of taking care of people who are working directly with people, but also for sharing your thoughts that this is a very rewarding job when helping another human being. I think it's very important also to stress that, because we are talking always how hard it is and about the
Yes.
supervision, but we forgot how it is very rewarding, rewarding job.
Definitely.
I'm open. We have 2-3 minutes more. If there are any kind of questions, please write it in the chat box. I see that Anna is wrote that she needs to go out. Thank you so much. Thank all of you for sharing all the 1 hour for staying with us. I saw that all the people stayed in the webinar room, so I believe it was very useful and interesting. Also, like always, I would just like to write it in the chat. If you need to receive a certificate of attending this webinar, you can write it in the email that I wrote you in the chat. Okay.
And if you have, I mean, I understand if you don't have any questions at the moment, but you can contact me through my email or through Facebook, Twitter, and also you can order the Heoni newsletter if you're interested on the topic and for example, the coming report on the same topic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Inka. I believe this is really useful. And as a last step, like always, I would like to share with you a final poll. Please take 1 minute to give us a feedback. It's really important for us to get it and to be in the contact with your needs. So also, thank you very much, and I believe, Inka, that we will be somehow in the contact through our project and our work. It was a pleasure to have you here with us. I would like to say thank you also for all of you for being with us, and of course, have a lovely day. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.